Rain came down in thin, relentless lines, the kind that soaked through confidence as easily as fabric. She stood at the edge of the sidewalk for a moment longer than necessary, staring up at the building as if it might speak first. It was older than she expected, brick dulled by time, windows uneven, a place that had learned how to survive without ever being noticed. This was not the world she belonged to. Boardrooms, glass towers, private drivers, that was her life. Yet her feet had carried her here without hesitation. Like they already knew this was overdue. She adjusted her coat, not because it was cold, but because her hands needed something to do. The address was right. She had checked it 3 times. Still, doubt pressed against her chest. She had negotiated billion-dollar deals without her pulse changing. But this made her breath shallow. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered that once she knocked, there would be no turning back. Her father's face flickered through her mind. Not as the powerful man the world remembered, but as he'd looked near the end, smaller, quieter, avoiding certain questions. He had died without resolving them, without fixing what he'd broken, and now those unfinished things had found their way to her. The hallway smelled faintly of old paint and cheap detergent. A child's laughter echoed from somewhere above, followed by a door slamming. Ordinary life, lives lived without press releases or legacy statements. She wondered how many nights this man had stood awake, worrying about rent, about tomorrow, about promises that never came true. She stopped in front of the door. The numbers were slightly crooked, like they'd been replaced more than once. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark wood. Perfect hair, controlled expression, a woman the world trusted with power. But beneath that reflection was a daughter who couldn't sleep anymore, carrying a debt that wasn't written on paper. She raised her hand. It hovered in the air, trembling despite her will. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure what words would come out once the door opened. Then she knocked. The knock echoed louder than he expected, sharp against the quiet of the apartment. He shifted the weight of his daughter on his arm, careful not to wake her fully. She had finally fallen asleep after asking, for the 3rd time that night, whether the lights would be shut off again. He took a breath, already tired before opening the door, already preparing himself for disappointment. Landlord, bill collector, someone wanting something he didn't have. When he opened the door, he froze. A woman stood there who looked completely out of place in his world. Her coat alone probably cost more than his monthly rent. Rain clung to her hair, softening what must have been a carefully controlled appearance. She didn't smile. She didn't look down on him either. Instead, her eyes flicked briefly to the child in his arms, then back to his face, as if she hadn't expected this detail and didn't quite know what to do with it. "Yes?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. Years of struggle had taught him not to show emotion too easily. Hope was expensive. She hesitated, and in that pause his instincts flared. People who came prepared usually spoke fast. She didn't. "I'm sorry to come so late," she said quietly. Her voice wasn't sharp or commanding. It was careful. "I won't take much of your time." He shifted again, feeling his daughter stir. Her small hand curled into his shirt, grounding him. "If this is about money," he said, not unkindly, "you've got the wrong place." Her lips parted, then closed. She inhaled like someone bracing for impact. "I'm here about a debt," she said, "one that should have been settled a long time ago." The word hit him harder than he expected. Debt. Old memories rose instantly. Documents, signatures, a handshake that had cost him everything. His jaw tightened. Whose debt? She met his eyes directly now, no flinching. "My father's." The hallway seemed to narrow. His grip on the door frame tightened as if the building itself might sway. He hadn't spoken that man's name in years, but the damage had never left. He looked at her again, really looked this time, and saw not a threat, but something closer to resolve mixed with regret. Behind him, his daughter shifted, her eyes opening just enough to peek past his shoulder. "Daddy?" she murmured. He glanced down at her, softening instantly. Then he looked back at the woman, suspicion and exhaustion warring in his chest. "What do you want?" he asked. She swallowed. "To talk," she said, "and to listen, if you'll let me." For reasons he couldn't yet explain, he didn't close the door. The moment she said her father's name, the air between them changed. It wasn't dramatic or loud, no raised voices, no slammed doors, but something invisible snapped tight, like an old wound pulled open without warning. His face lost what little color it had, and for a second, he looked past her, not at her, as if the hallway had turned into a doorway to another time. He stepped back instinctively, the way a person does when they recognize danger too late. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice lower now, guarded. The exhaustion in his eyes sharpened into something harder. Anger, buried deep and kept quiet for years. She felt it immediately, the weight of that name landing on him like a blow. Her chest tightened. She had rehearsed explanations, apologies, even silence. None of them felt right anymore. This wasn't a conversation. It was a collision. "That man destroyed everything I built," he continued, each word measured, controlled. "I trusted him. I believed him. And I paid for it." His grip on the door loosened, not because he was calm, but because holding it took too much effort. "You don't get to walk in here like this and pretend it's just business." "I'm not pretending," she said quickly, before fear could shut her down. Her voice trembled despite her best effort. "I know what he did. I know he never fixed it." She swallowed, forcing herself to stay steady. "That's why I came." He shook his head once, a short, humorless motion. "You think knowing makes it better?" He let out a bitter breath. "I lost my company, my savings, my marriage. Nights like this," he gestured vaguely around the small apartment, "are what I got in return." Her eyes moved again, taking in the cramped space, the quiet struggle it represented. She had read reports. She had seen numbers. None of that prepared her for this, for the living proof of damage that never showed up on balance sheets. "I can't undo it," she said softly. "If I could, I would." Her throat tightened. "But I refuse to pretend it didn't happen just because he's gone." For a long moment, he said nothing. The hallway light flickered faintly overhead. Behind him, his daughter shifted again, half awake, sensing tension she didn't understand. Finally, he stepped aside just enough to let the door open wider. Not an invitation, not forgiveness, just space. "Say what you came to say," he said. "Then we'll see what's left after that." He let out a short, hollow laugh, the kind that carried no humor at all. It slipped out before he could stop it, sharp and tired, echoing in the narrow space between them. "You keep saying debt," he said, shaking his head slowly, "like it's a number you can just write down and erase." His eyes flicked toward the table inside, cluttered with unopened envelopes and overdue notices. "If this were just money, I wouldn't still be standing here like this." She followed his gaze, and for the first time since arriving, she truly stepped into his world. The apartment was small, lived in, holding the quiet evidence of constant effort. A child's drawing was taped crookedly to the wall. The couch sagged in the middle. There was no chaos, only the discipline of someone doing their best with too little. It tightened something in her chest. "I know money doesn't fix everything," she said carefully. "I'm not here to insult you by pretending it does." She paused, choosing honesty over polish. "But money was the weapon he used, and I can't ignore that." He leaned back against the wall, exhaustion settling into his bones. "He didn't just take my savings," he said. "He took my time, years I'll never get back. Nights I spent staring at ceilings, wondering how I'd explain to my wife that things were getting worse, not better." His voice dropped. "She left before I could." Her breath caught, but she didn't interrupt. She didn't defend her father. That silence mattered more than words. "My daughter doesn't know any of this," he continued, glancing toward the bedroom where soft breathing drifted out. "She just knows I'm always tired, that sometimes I say no when other dads say yes." His jaw tightened. "That's the real debt." She nodded slowly, tears threatening but held in place by respect. "Then let me carry some of it." she said. Not to buy forgiveness, not to rewrite your past, but because you shouldn't be the only one paying for his choices. He studied her face, searching for something false. He found none, only a woman weighed down by an inheritance she never asked for. The hallway clock ticked loudly, filling the silence. "You know," he said finally, "I spent years imagining what I'd say to him if I ever saw him again." He looked at her, eyes steady now. "I never imagined his daughter would be the one standing here." Neither had she. And in that moment, they both understood this debt had already changed them, whether it could ever truly be settled or not. She reached for the collar of her coat, fingers moving slowly, deliberately, as if rushing might break something fragile between them. The fabric slid from her shoulders and into her hands, heavy and expensive, a symbol of a life built on control and distance. She folded it neatly and placed it on the back of the chair near the door, not with carelessness, but with intention. It was a small gesture, but it stripped away the last visible barrier between them. "My father died last winter," she said. The words felt strange every time she spoke them, like they didn't quite belong to her yet. It was quiet, no headlines, no final speech. She let out a breath. "He never mentioned you, never mentioned what he did." He said nothing, but his posture stiffened. Grief and anger often lived too close together. "I waited," she continued, her voice lower now, "for some kind of explanation, an apology, something in his papers, his emails, anything that showed he understood the damage." She shook her head. There was nothing, just accounts, assets, and unresolved names. Her eyes lifted to his. Yours was one of them. She sat down, uninvited, but not assuming. For the first time since she'd arrived, she looked tired. Not powerful, not composed, just human. "I spent my whole life cleaning up his messes inside the company," she said, "covering mistakes, fixing deals, making sure no one ever saw the cracks." Her voice wavered. "But this wasn't something I could bury." He watched her carefully, unsure where this was leading, but unable to deny the sincerity in her tone. "I don't expect sympathy," she added quickly. "Losing him didn't make me a victim. It just made me responsible." Her hands clenched in her lap. Responsible for what he refused to face. For a long moment, the room was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. He thought of all the nights he had replayed that betrayal, imagining confrontation, imagining closure. None of those versions looked like this. "So you came here," he said slowly, "because of guilt?" She met his gaze without flinching. "Because of accountability," she corrected. "Guilt fades, accountability doesn't." Something shifted in him then. Not forgiveness, not trust, but recognition. She wasn't asking him to absolve her father. She was standing in the place he'd abandoned. And for the first time since she knocked on the door, he saw her not as his enemy's daughter, but as someone brave enough to carry a truth that wasn't hers to create. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he moved to the small table by the wall and pulled out a chair, the legs scraping softly against the floor. The sound felt louder than it was, like it carried years of words he'd swallowed. He sat, rubbing his hands together once, then resting them flat, as if grounding himself before stepping into something painful. "You're the first person who's ever asked me to talk about it," he said at last. His voice wasn't bitter anymore, just tired. Everyone else wanted summaries, numbers, timelines. He shook his head. No one wanted the story. She leaned forward slightly, elbows on her knees, giving him her full attention. No phone, no interruptions, just presence. "It started as a partnership," he continued. "I had a small company. Nothing flashy, but it was mine. Years of work. Your father came in with promises, connections, growth, security." A faint smile crossed his face, then disappeared. "I believed him because I wanted to believe him. He described the slow unraveling, contracts rewritten at the last minute, pressure disguised as advice, trust turned into leverage. By the time I realized what was happening, he said quietly, everything was legally his, and all the risk was still mine. She listened, jaw tight, each detail landing like a weight. She had seen versions of this play out in boardrooms, stripped of consequence. Here, every decision had a face. When the company collapsed, so did everything else, he went on. Bills piled up. My wife tried to stay strong, but fear changes people. His eyes drifted toward the hallway. She left when our daughter was barely walking. Said she couldn't raise a child on promises. The room felt smaller, heavier. She resisted the urge to interrupt, to apologize again, knowing this wasn't about her words. I stopped telling people the truth, he admitted. It was easier to say I failed than explain how I was taken apart piece by piece. He looked up at her then, really looked. Carrying that alone does something to you. Her eyes burned, but she held steady. Thank you for trusting me with it, she said softly. He exhaled as if a pressure he'd carried for years had shifted just slightly. Being heard didn't erase the damage, but it made it real in a way silence never had. And in that moment, she understood something important. This wasn't just about paying a debt. It was about witnessing the truth of it. She reached into her bag slowly, not with the confidence she used in boardrooms, but with care, as if every movement needed permission. The leather was soft, worn at the edges despite its price, something she carried often, something that held more than contracts and keys tonight. She pulled out a checkbook and rested it on the table between them. The simple action made his shoulders tense. I don't want this to feel like an ending, she said quietly, and I don't want it to feel like an insult. He watched in silence as she uncapped the pen. The sound was faint, but it echoed in his chest. Money had always been loud in his life, when there wasn't enough of it. She didn't ask for a number, she already knew. She had memorized the losses, the interest, the years. Her pen moved steadily, no hesitation, no bargaining. When she slid the check toward him, the amount made his breath catch. It wasn't just enough to clear what had been taken. It acknowledged the time, the consequences, the weight of survival. He stared at it, hands unmoving. His fingers twitched once, then stilled. This is more than the debt, he said, voice rough. She nodded. I know. Silence filled the room again, thicker now. He reached for the check but didn't pick it up, as if touching it might make the moment real in a way he wasn't ready for. His hands shook slightly, betraying how much effort it took to stay composed. Why? He asked finally, not accusing, not grateful, just confused. Why do this when you could have stayed away and no one would have blamed you? She looked at him, eyes shining but steady. Because walking away would have been easier, she said. And my father always chose easy when it came to responsibility. The words landed between them, honest and unpolished. I don't expect this to erase anything, she added. It won't give you back your marriage or those years, but it can give you room to breathe, and your daughter a future that isn't shaped by his choices. He closed his eyes for a moment, a long, unguarded pause. When he opened them again, something had shifted, not relief, not joy, but release, the kind that comes when a burden is finally shared. He picked up the check. I don't know how to feel, he admitted. She offered a small, sad smile. You don't have to know, she said. Just don't carry it alone anymore. He held the check loosely, as if gripping it too tightly might tear something open inside him. The number stared back at him, unreal, like a promise he'd learned not to trust. He looked up at her again, studying her face, searching for the crack. Some sign this was charity dressed up as guilt. What he found instead was conflict and resolve. You didn't answer me, he said quietly. Not really. His thumb brushed the edge of the paper. People don't do this unless they're trying to fix themselves. She didn't deny it. Instead, she drew a slow breath, the kind taken before saying something that had lived inside too long. "I spent my entire career running from his shadow," she said. "Every promotion, every deal. I told myself it proved I was different." Her gaze drifted downward. "But the higher I went, the clearer it became who helped him rise in the first place." She looked back up, eyes glistening now. "My success was built on structures he shaped, on money that never should have been mine." Her voice faltered, then steadied. "I can't change where I came from, but I can choose what I carry forward." He listened, the room holding its breath with him. "When he died," she continued, "everyone talked about his legacy, what he built, what he left behind." A bitter smile touched her lips. No one talked about who paid the price. Her hands tightened in her lap. "I don't want to inherit silence." The words struck deeper than she expected. He swallowed hard, feeling something shift in his chest. This wasn't a transaction. This was a confession. "You know," he said slowly, "I used to imagine confronting him, telling him exactly what he did to my family." He exhaled. "I never imagined his daughter would say it first." She blinked back tears. "I don't need you to forgive him," she said. "Or me." Her voice softened. "I just need to know that his story doesn't end with your pain buried and forgotten." The check trembled slightly as he folded it once, carefully, and placed it on the table, not pocketing it yet, respecting the moment. For the first time since she arrived, he didn't feel like he was speaking to the past. He was speaking to someone who understood the cost of carrying another person's mistakes, and had chosen to face it anyway. The silence was broken by a soft rustle from the hallway. Small footsteps padded across the floor, unsteady and slow, the way children move when they're not fully awake. His daughter appeared at the doorway, clutching a worn stuffed animal, hair messy from sleep. Her eyes moved between them, curious, confused, sensing something serious without knowing why. "Daddy," she whispered. He stood immediately, all the heaviness in his shoulders easing the moment he saw her. "Hey," he said gently, kneeling to her level. "You should be in bed." She rubbed one eye and looked past him, studying the woman sitting at the table. There was no fear in her gaze, only open curiosity. "Who's she?" the child asked. He hesitated, then glanced back at the woman. The CEO felt her throat tighten. She wasn't used to being seen like this, not without titles, not without distance. "I'm a friend," she said softly, the word surprising even herself. The little girl tilted her head, considering this. She took a few careful steps forward, bare feet cold against the floor, and stopped just short of the table. She looked up at the woman's face, then at her eyes. "You look sad," she said matter-of-factly. The observation hit harder than any accusation. The woman's breath caught. She nodded once. "I am," she admitted. The child thought about that, then held out her stuffed animal. "You can borrow him," she said. "He helps me when I'm sad." For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The woman's carefully held composure cracked. She reached out slowly, taking the toy as if it were something fragile and priceless. Her fingers trembled. "Thank you," she whispered, voice thick. The child smiled, satisfied, then turned to her father. "She's nice," she said. "Can she stay a little?" He felt his chest tighten. He nodded. "Just for a bit." The woman wiped at her eyes, embarrassed but unashamed. No boardroom, no negotiation had ever disarmed her like this. In that simple gesture, the child had done what years of guilt and success couldn't. She reminded her why she'd come. And as the little girl climbed back into her father's arms, something fragile but real settled into the room. Not forgiveness, not closure, but the quiet beginning of healing. After she was tucked back into bed, the apartment felt different. Quieter, but not empty. The kind of quiet that comes after something important has been said without words. He returned to the table slowly and sat down, his movements thoughtful, measured, like he was relearning how to occupy space. He looked at the woman across from him for a long moment, not with anger this time, not even with suspicion, just honesty. "I need to say something," he began. His voice was steady but firm, "and I need you to hear it without trying to fix it." She nodded immediately. "I will. I don't forgive your father," he said plainly. No hesitation, no cruelty, just truth. "What he did shaped my life in ways I still live with every day." His eyes lowered briefly, then lifted again. "That doesn't disappear because he's gone, and it doesn't disappear because of money." She didn't flinch. Relief and sadness crossed her face at once. "I wouldn't expect you to," she said, "or ask you to." He exhaled, as if releasing a breath he'd been holding since she arrived. "But you," he continued, choosing his words carefully, "you didn't hide. You didn't send a lawyer or a check in the mail." His gaze sharpened slightly. "You came yourself." She swallowed. "It was the least I could do." "No," he corrected gently. "It wasn't easy. It was brave." The words settled between them, unexpected and heavy. She looked down, shaking her head faintly. "Brave doesn't feel like this," she said quietly. "It feels like guilt and fear, and not knowing if I'll be rejected." He gave a small, tired smile. "That's what courage usually looks like up close." There was another pause. Then he added, "You're not your father." The sentence was simple, but it landed like a turning point. Her breath caught. No one had ever said it to her like that, without reassurance, without expectation. "I know I can't undo what he did," he went on, "but I won't pretend you're responsible for his choices." He met her eyes. "What you did tonight matters." Her eyes filled again, but this time the tears didn't fall from pain alone. Something lighter had entered the room. Forgiveness hadn't been given. It hadn't been asked for. But respect, real, earned respect, had taken its place. She stood slowly, gathering her coat from the chair but not putting it on right away. It felt heavier now, like something she didn't need as much as before. The room had given her more than she expected. Not comfort, but clarity. She looked around one last time, taking in the small details she hadn't noticed earlier. The framed photo of him and his daughter at a park, the chipped mug near the sink, the quiet order of a life built carefully after being broken. "I should go," she said softly. There was no urgency in her voice, only respect for the space they had shared. He nodded, standing as well. "Thank you," he replied, then paused, as if the words felt incomplete. "Not just for the money, for showing up." She hesitated at the door, then turned back. "If you ever need help," she said, choosing her words carefully, "not favors, not charity, just support, call me." She slid a simple card onto the table, no title printed on it, just her name and number. "You don't owe me anything." He picked it up, studying it for a moment before placing it beside the folded check. "I'll remember that," he said, and for the first time, it didn't sound like a polite dismissal. They walked together to the door. The hallway light flickered again, briefly illuminating the space between them. It no longer felt like a barrier. As she stepped out, she paused. "You're doing a good job," she said quietly. "Your daughter, she's lucky." His throat tightened, but he managed a nod. "So are you," he said, surprising them both. The door closed gently behind her. She stood there for a moment, listening to the muted sounds of life continuing inside. Footsteps, a soft voice, the ordinary rhythm she rarely experienced. Then she turned and walked down the hallway, her heels softer against the floor than when she had arrived. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air felt cleaner, lighter. She breathed deeply, realizing that for the first time in years, she wasn't running from her past or trying to outpace it. Behind that door, a single father stood a little taller, carrying less weight than before. and she walked away, knowing that sometimes closure doesn't come with forgiveness or grand endings, but with two people choosing honesty and letting that be enough. Years later, the memory of that night returned to her not as pain, but as a quiet marker in her life. One of those moments that divide everything into before and after. She would think of it on long flights, staring out at clouds while reports waited unread on her tablet. Of the small apartment. Of a man who had every reason to shut a door and chose not to. She kept her promise. Not in grand gestures or public announcements, but in steady human ways. The money cleared his debts, yes, but more importantly, it gave him time. Time to breathe, to plan, to be present. He rebuilt slowly, carefully, on his own terms. Not because she rescued him, but because the ground beneath him finally stopped shifting. They didn't become close in the way stories often demand. There were no dramatic reunions, no forced friendship, just occasional messages, updates, a shared understanding that didn't need explanation. Once, he sent her a photo of his daughter on her first day of school. Backpack too big, smile even bigger. She kept it. Her company continued to grow, but the way she led it changed. She asked harder questions. She listened longer. She paid attention to the quiet consequences hidden behind clean numbers. When someone talked about acceptable losses, she thought of a child offering a stuffed animal to a stranger. Her father's name still appeared in articles and archives, often softened by time. She didn't fight it publicly. She didn't need to. She had learned that legacy isn't what survives in print, it's what gets carried forward in silence, in choice, in action. As for him, there came a day when he stood in a different apartment, sunlight filling the room, his daughter laughing freely. He thought of that night less as a wound and more as a turning point. Not forgiveness, but fairness. Not forgetting, but release. Sometimes at night, she would remember the words he'd said. "You're not your father." They stayed with her. Not as comfort, but as responsibility. Her father had died owing a debt he never repaid. She had paid it, not just with money, but with presence, humility, and truth. And in doing so, two lives moved forward. Lighter, steadier, and finally free enough to begin again.